Welcome back. I hope you come back with a fresh mind for the next session, which is a very important one. We now start with our second morning session. What lessons can we draw from the Balkans? And I would love to welcome the distinguished moderator for this session, Ivana Dragičević. So, Ivana, the stage is yours.
1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. They told us that we should, in the first part of the panel, have a protagonist and antagonist. If we talk about origins of the concept of protagonist and antagonist, we come to the Greek tragedy. Aristotle, in his Poetics, as I remember, first wrote about a famous poet that we all know from ancient Greece. His name was Thespis, and he introduced the first actor who came out of the chorus. Aeschylus was the one who introduced the second actor, and Sophocles the one who introduced third. So if we have such a distinguished chorus here, and if we think about the concept of protagonist and antagonist here, I'm not so sure that we have an antagonism, because if we put a line under what we're talking about, and what Natalie was touching upon in her presentation, is basically that we are here, I suppose, all on the side of something that we still call liberal democracy. So, from the side of Aeschylus team, I will call our first protagonist, Mr. Nikola Dimitrov, to join me here in front of the chorus, and my second protagonist in this little drama class we will have at the beginning of this panel is Mr. Misha Glenny. Please give him a round of applause. So we heard a lot about huge concepts and words of today and history. Where are we going to go? How will this conflict end? You can shake hands. It's not a boxsmith. We're here on the same side of history. So I don't know, I want to challenge you first. We'll have 10, 15 minutes of talk and then involve the whole panel. When you were listening to this first panel, what are the pickups or the buzzwords or the concepts that we need to address here to put a parallel with what happened in the Balkans or what is still happening in the Balkans? And what are the mistakes or challenges that people in the Balkans still have that could be connected or accelerated with the Ukrainian, concerning Ivan's last point that he made, that we need to also change Europe? Okay, Misha.
Well, the first thing that struck me was the centrality for some of the discussants earlier on the issue of EU candidacy status. Mm-hmm. And as I'm here with Nikola Dimitrov, I think it's only appropriate to remember that in the year 2000, which is 22 years ago, at the end of what was a sort of mini civil war in what I used to call at the time the Republic of Macedonia. It wasn't really a mini civil war, it was a clash between criminal factions trying to control the cigarette trade in Macedonia at the time. But the peace deal, the Ohrid Agreement, included candidacy status for the Republic of Macedonia. And since the year 2000, Macedonia has been a candidate member from the EU, the most advanced of all. Of course, Croatia and Slovenia, then Croatia jumped over it, as did Slovenia, both a few years later. So candidacy status in itself does not guarantee much. I was at a conference in Paris 2 weeks ago about the issue of enlargement into the Western Balkans, and it was the first sort of diplomatic, NGO, political discussion I'd been for a long time, because I've been doing other things about the Western Balkans. And what struck me is the debate had not changed over 20 years or so, even though the circumstances had changed hugely. Now, in terms of what we were discussing earlier on, in terms of Ukraine and in terms of the Western Balkans, there is two absolutely massive differences. One, Russia possesses almost half of the nuclear warheads that exist on this planet. and it is also a member of the P5 in the Security Council. So in that sense, the two conflicts are not comparable. The other thing is the implications of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict go far beyond the implications of the conflict in the Western Balkans, to wit, food supplies, energy costs, all of these huge sub-dramas that are going on and which threaten stability not just in Europe, but well beyond Europe. And so if you look at the Western Balkans, that's not so much a global problem. It is a sub-drama. It is a problem for Europe. And Europe will not be able to solve anything in the Ukraine unless it also addresses simultaneously the issue of the Western Balkans.
And then we'll have a backhand to Nicola. We heard these grand new ideas of both Emmanuel Macron and Charles Michel, which will be discussed later, I suppose, in a panel about the future of EU. But it does tackle enlargement, it does tackle Ukraine, and it does tackle Western Balkans. We saw yesterday beautiful pictures from Belgrade, Charles Michel eating cevapcici with Aleksandar Vučić. So where do you position all of this?
Yes. The first, what resonated to me a lot, especially from speakers related to Ukraine in the previous session, was this major attachment, huge hopes with regard to the European future. And if I put this in terms of a song title, it will be Stairway to Heaven. The experience of the region is regrettably closer to another song, which is A Road to Nowhere, Talking Heads. And I think
Talking
it
Heads
was
a good name of the band also, with the name of the song. Yeah.
I think it was Carolina who mentioned the word kaput in a different context, but frankly speaking, the enlargement policy of the EU today in the region is seen as a kaput.
Obsolete,
process.
what someone said recently.
Misha mentioned our story. This was the Stabilization and Association Agreement. We were the first in the region that signed it. We've been a candidate country since 2005, 17 years. Since 2009, we had a steady stream of positive recommendations by the Commission. They fulfill criteria, they should start accession talks. They fulfill criteria, they should start accession talks. But even a decision in March 2020 by the EU to say, we decide to start accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania, over 2 years now, this is still not happening. So I think one lesson here for our friends in Ukraine will be a word of caution. This is not impossible. We have to keep on fighting, but only that something is obviously right and needed to be done, and a decision to be made doesn't really mean that European leaders will actually do it. So we have to keep pushing in this direction.
But it's interesting because there are two narratives that go on vis-à-vis Europe inside the Balkan. One is a very bureaucratized diplomatic narrative of meetings here, meetings there, slowly pushing things forward, which doesn't interest ordinary people in the region. They're fed up with all those endless talks. And then the other narrative coming from Europe are these sudden sharp shocks, as when President Macron and the Dutch government decided that Albania and North Macedonia were not going to progress to the next stage. Now, that is felt by people inside the Western Balkans, because they say, every time we try and do something, someone slaps it down because there are local elections going on in France, and they don't want to lose half a percentage point in those local elections. And then Bulgaria, of course, chips in and suddenly decides to revive a discredited, historical discourse from 70 years or so ago in order to block Macedonia. But actually what's going on is domestic Bulgarian politics. So every time this region tries to move forward, we have domestic politics inside the European Union bringing down the gates so that they can't enter. And those narratives have got to change, because Putin's narrative in parts of the Balkans is actually more convincing. It's emotive, it doesn't actually mean anything, and it won't lead anywhere positive, but it's a more entertaining narrative than the bureaucratic narrative of the European Union.
And talking about narratives and, sense and sensibility of this time and of that time was, two reactions in the Balkans. In the first days of the war, all global media were saying this is the first conflict in European soil after the Second World War. The sentiment in the Balkans was like, come on, what happened with us in the 90s? Second sentiment was this with, we will grant Ukraine EU accession. Wait a minute, what are we doing for past 20 years? So these are the things that are very, very present. Talking about these huge subjects, what Natalie was touching, what's behind the conflict, is it security-based, realistic, or ideology, or what Florence was saying about, what is behind, what's the nature of the conflict, so how long does it take, because we still have cars being bashed, depending who parks where in which of the countries. So how do you see this kind of whole bunch of reconciliation, trust building, rebuilding in these circumstances where we still don't know, how long will this conflict take and what is the core of it at all? Who wants to start? Nico?
Yes, going back to our Ivan Krastev, who some years ago defined the region of the Western Balkans as the soft underbelly of Europe. This is a title we borrowed from Italy in a very different context, Winston Churchill, etc. I think it is wise when we have war on our continent. We knew for a while now that we cannot take democracy for granted. We now know that we cannot take peace for granted. And when the European security order is under attack, it is wise to consolidate. This means sanction the aggressor, help the victim, the Ukrainians. This means take your own defense more seriously, become more unified, and we're seeing signals of that, right? More defense spending all of a sudden throughout Europe, something that has been an issue in the NATO debate for years now, this 2%.
Common, purchase, what we saw the other day.
But it also makes sense to consolidate a region that is within EU's geography. This region is surrounded by member states. So even the term enlargement is somewhat misleading. It's more completion or consolidation. And this is a region where we've seen in the recent years geopolitical competition. And the role of Kremlin has been the role of a spoiler. Prevent a success, create a failure, disinform, confuse. This is a region that is still not certain. There are pockets of uncertainties. Kosovo, Serbia, the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it makes sense to consolidate. This is in Europe's self-interest.
Before anything flares up again and suddenly you've got something else you're dealing with.
And to touch upon that, about the roots of the conflict and was it settled at all?
In a way, the success of the EU here, if it cannot create a win in this region, which in total is about 1/3 of Ukraine's population, surrounded by member states, on the track for 15, 20 years now for most of the countries, what will the credibility be of the EU in what it says to Ukraine?
So in terms of what you're saying about the conflict, I think the conflict in Yugoslavia in many respects was about the rapid privatization of state assets inside the former Yugoslavia, but channeled through nationalist sentiments. It is possible, I haven't looked closely enough, I've begun to look at it a little, that the Russia-Ukraine war also has aspects of a resource grab about it, but that's something perhaps we can talk about a little later. But look, I often get asked, why did I decide to apply for the job as the new rector of the IWM? Well, there were many reasons, but one of the reasons is for the past 7 years or so, I've been working in television production, writing and producing television drama shows. Now, I just had a drama commissioned. I started working on that drama 7 years ago. During that 7 years, I've spent hundreds of hours working on it. I've been paid so far about 10,000 euros for it. Now that it's been commissioned, I will start to get more money for it, a lot more money, I hope, than 10,000 euros. But here's something that applies to the Western Balkans, is just as television production is for the creatives involved, the work is front-loaded, the rewards are always back-loaded. What we have to do now in the Western Balkans, and there was part of this discussion about Ukraine, which I think was very relevant, we have to start front-loading the rewards and back-loading some of the work, because they have shown their commitment over the past 20 years time and time again. It's really crazy that Bulgaria and Romania receive as much money as they do, whilst you're seeing the draining of economic opportunity in the Western Balkans, which is threatening social stability. So please rethink how we structure this.
And thank you. And talking about that, we'll have, just to add.
It's very difficult to be an antagonist now.
But to add to that, so we already mentioned in June with the EU Council, we'll have, Western Balkans leader coming to the table discussing the propositions that we heard. What do you think about these propositions?
Currently, the heart of the process is conditionality. You do your job, you reform, there is progress, EU keeps its promise. If there is backsliding, EU speaks out or take action. You can also go backwards. This is now broken. For political considerations, political families, relationships with leaders, it's difficult for the EU to name and shame when there is backsliding. But it's also difficult to reward and empower agents of change. And this was, I think, most strikingly with the Prespa agreement, where we had virtually every single European leader in Skopje addressing the Macedonian citizens saying, you support this deal,
It's done.
we promise you, you will start accession talks. And this promise was not kept. So we lost that momentum, and this resonates throughout the region. So what do we have to show in terms of results? We have Montenegro, 10 years in the accession talks. Poland did it in 7 years. Croatia did it in 8 years. Serbia is in the process for 8 years. In terms of preparedness, because we've been for so long aligning through the association agreement, North Macedonia is even slightly better in the cluster of fundamentals than these countries. A few days ago, there was the Media Freedom Index by the Reporters Beyond Borders. We are 57th in the world.
Like 50%.
Some of our neighbors, members of the EU, are doing much worse.
Like Greece
Bulgaria,
is
for
about 100,
example.
something.
And Greece even, my friends in Greece, on this.
People get shot in Greece.
So what Misha said, and it somewhat resembles President Michel's speech on enlargement, where he says we should move away from the binary, either you're fully in, but if you're fully out, you don't get anything. And we have to create tangible rewards for those who deliver. And this means access to funds. A citizen of the region gets about 500 euros annually, EU assistance. A citizen from a member state from the region gets about 5,000. So it's 1 to 10, 1 to 11. If we add here the trade deficit of 7 to 9 billions per year, and the brain drain, the depletion of the region, it's really almost impossible to talk about convergence. It's going to be more and more divergence. So we have to act in this region. The credibility is online. There was an editorial in The Economist that said, if Europe wants to be a global player, it must become a local one first. And the region of the Western Balkans is local to the European Union.
Everyone is escaping the question of reconciliation and war, but okay, please.
Yeah, those demographic questions that you raised are incredibly important. I'm sure Ivan Krastev will have something to say about this, because these are things which don't take very long to happen, a matter of 5, 7, 10 years, but they take a very long time to reconstitute. And I mean, throughout Europe and the United States, we come across people from Albania, we come across the entire construction industry in the United Kingdom is now run by Albanians, not just the people working on building sites, but the people who run the companies. And as Gerald pointed out, they are not going back now to Albania. They're staying in the UK, staying in the US and other parts of Europe. These are the most economically dynamic part of the population. They tend to be young, they tend to be educated, and they are leaving very, very fast. Our problem is that you then have a population which is getting older, which is more conservative, and which is, for example, more susceptible in the case of Serbia and North Macedonia, for example, to other more conservative narratives. So it's not just that, you know, we can wait another 15, 20 years and they'll still be waiting, happy to come in. Things are changing inside the Western Balkans, and they're not changing for the better in a really profound way. And you're seeing, I talked about narratives earlier on, you're seeing competing narratives again within the Western Balkans. So for example, if you go to Bosnia, there is, amongst the Bosniaks, there is a strong feeling that Vučić is another Milosevic. He's a strong man who wants to spread Serbian influence all over Bosnia, Kosovo, and so on and so forth. If you go to Serbia, there is, amongst Serbian liberals, a very strong counter-narrative that Vučić feels squeezed between the promise of Europe and the pressure of the right wing of his own party and the popularity of Putin amongst some sections of the population. And these narratives are becoming further and further apart, and they preface dangerous developments unless we see some real positive move forward.
I have to
reconciliation.
Okay, please,
Because
final.
You blamed us a bit.
No, I didn't blame, but okay, we'll pick up later also at some point.
I will quote from the Carnegie report on the Balkan Wars, the one published in 1914. In the introduction, the authors say that the best title for the report would be Divided Europe and its Demoralizing Action in the Balkans. And this resonates. But it ends essentially saying the real culprit are not the peoples of the Balkans. The real culprit are those who, pursuing their self-interest, undermine the general one, work on the sterile policy of reprisals and confrontation. But there is no other way for small countries or big countries but the way of reconciliation and unification. And it will take years. I am in my own family and the Prespa agreement, my grandfather was born in what is now Greece, in Greek Macedonia. He was part of the civil war after the Second World War. And I am a second generation of a fighter in that war who is proud to have played a role in solving issues between the two nations and paving the way towards friendship. So I think it happens, but it's a question of time and it's a question of leadership. It will take generations.
The last question before I move you back and we open the floor to our experts is, there's one question which has been framed in this introduction of the panel. What are the pitfalls to watch out for? You've mentioned people being shot in other contexts than the war, and you wrote a lot about it and researched a lot about it. What, we can say it frankly, what Ukraine was before the war was a very corrupted society. The result of transition from, socialist, federative system, whatever you call it, how do you want, from Yugoslavia to nation states through the war, was a process of mech mafias. So, this is the core issue of our global order, because if we sanction these guys who have bank accounts and we cannot find some things through Panama Papers, so how do we also deal with that if we talk about changing the world order or whatever?
Well, Serhii Plokhy, I think, made a very good point about what the Marshall Plan needs to do. The Marshall Plan in Europe after the Second World War was mutually beneficial to Western Europe and the United States. It opened up markets for American capital and American industry so that it could make money out of the post-war period, and of course it led to the reconstruction. And we should be looking at models like that, including the emergence of new political structures, because you're right. The phenomenon of McMafia, as I called it, as it merged in the former Soviet Union and throughout the Balkans at the end of the war, proved to be very attractive. It had a symbiotic relationship with certain practices of neoliberalism and Western capital, and it has penetrated large parts of the Western world. Let's be frank. Donald Trump has well-documented ties to the mob in New Jersey, for example. Boris Johnson has taken millions and millions of pounds from Russian donors who our own intelligence services say are dubious sources. So this has become a more global problem, not just an Eastern problem. But when it comes to the reconstruction, and this is the point of the acquis communautaire, it's just that they're done in an incredibly sort of slow and bureaucratic way, but when it comes to the reconstruction, there has to be a recognition that that oligarchic system which emerged in Ukraine after 1990 needs to be revised. There needs to be checks and balances to prevent that extreme concentration of capital, whether in Ukraine or indeed in the Western Balkans and more broadly in the Western world, frankly.
I'd like to touch upon what I think could be a solution, and it involves 2 or 3 elements. First, I think we have to pay attention to make sure that the dynamic between the European future of the Western Balkans and the European future and the aspirations of the Ukrainians and the Georgians and the Moldovans are not negatively misused. Because I think some people who don't really like the idea of enlargement and there is no vision behind it could use the region as an excuse to slow down Ukraine, to say, no, but we have to deal first with the Western Balkans. But what are you going to do differently with the Western Balkans now? Well, more of the same. So we need to create a positive dynamic here. Second, what Ivan said, the intensity of this war is such, the paradigm shift is so grand that it will change the EU itself as well. And I think there are ideas in the current debate that can help us to marry the widening debate, enlargement, and the deepening debate, reform of the EU. And I don't think this is impossible to do. Because for the citizens of the region, being European means live in a democracy, rule of law, justice, accountable politicians, free media, decency, normalcy. The people are not interested in entering a dysfunctional union. where also internally you can have examples of illiberals or electoral autocracies, etc. So we are in this together. And this dichotomy is to some extent fake, used against us, both against the EU and against this drive to become European in this region that is geographically in its midst. Keeping the Balkans away helps the illiberal vision. If the enlargement is the most important geopolitical tool, use it. Because you're giving this void vacuum for foreign actors and for the ideology of illiberalism.
Nikola Dimitrov, Misha, Glenny, thank you so much. Give them a round of applause for the introduction.
Great.
And I'll pass first Natalie 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. I think I simply wanted to highlight the fact that I think what we're living through now highlights a point that actually was there all along, but we didn't really recognize it, meaning that enlargement has always been political. And at times we forgot about it, right? Because indeed it was a political project, sort of in technical clothing. But it was political. It was political when it happened. The Eastern enlargement, I mean, this was all about, beyond the technicalities of the accession process, this was about the reunification of Europe. It was an imperative that would have happened no matter what. It was political when it stopped happening. It was, the way in which enlargement became politicized within the European Union, the so-called enlargement fatigue, and of course, both the Western Balkans and Turkey have been a victim of this. Now, which I think, Nicola, speaks to your point, the opportunity, which, however, could also work the other way, of enlargement because of Ukraine coming back as a political project. And I think it will only become a political project in the positive sense that you were highlighting, indeed, if the EU walks and chews gum at the same time. Traditionally there's been a sequencing of kind of widening and deepening, and the truth is that if it is going to be a positive political project which will hold both for Ukraine and for the Western Balkans, it will only be able to happen if there is this deepening and widening going hand in hand.
Thank you so much. Ivan Krastev, then Susanne Scholl.
Thank you very much. First, listening to comparing first and second panel, I understand that the problem with the frozen solutions can be more depressive than the frozen conflict. Because then there is no question when. Frozen solution can be frozen forever. But secondly, I just want to push for one aspect of how the Ukrainian crisis is going to affect the Western Balkans, about which we're not talking much. And the story was European Union has one utopia, and this is the utopia of normality. In a certain way, European Union was about post-heroic societies. European project believed in Bertolt Brecht's that pity for nations that need heroes. And what happened with Ukraine is that basically Europeans reimagined and in my view reassessed the importance of civic heroism in a moment of the possibility to sacrifice your life for something, particularly for the self-determination, for sovereignty, and it's not by accident that it came after a long COVID period in which basically sacrifice of human lives were perceived as almost unimaginable. I'm saying this because this creates a totally different dynamics than what was during the Yugoslav wars. Suddenly you have the power of liberal nationalism. During the Yugoslav wars, to be European was very strongly anti-nationalist in each of the countries. And here, this is not exactly the same. And part of the Ukrainian effect and Zelensky effect is the following. Many of the small countries in European Union, we try to assert their sovereignty, but strangely enough, not fighting the enemy, but fighting the allies. Trying to fight Brussels and to say, you cannot impose anything on me. We have 3 Bulgarians on a panel, so we can share the responsibility for Bulgarian position on Northern Macedonia. But I want to say something very important. Nobody is going to understand the behavior of our countries if they don't understand that this is not so much about Northern Macedonia, but it is very much political elites which are not particularly trusted by the public, going and saying, we are sovereign because I can say no to Brussels. We are sovereign because I can say no to Washington. So this is also part of the Ukrainian effect. Now everybody wants to become Zelensky. And the difference between Zelensky and Havel is that Havel was in love with Europe, but not much interested to criticize Europe because it was a different historical period. Now Zelensky is in love with Europe, but it's kind of a tough love. And we're going to see this happening in other countries too. I try to push for my sovereignty, showing that nobody can impose me on anything. But for European Union, this is a big issue. If the small countries and the Croat president coming also with a very interesting idea that he's going to blackmail with this and that. Blackmail as the way to assert sovereignty is something that can paralyze European Union in a moment in which European Union really should be transformed in order to be effective. But this is also part, strangely enough, of the Ukrainian effect, where you have a post-heroic societies which are in search of heroism.
Wow. Susanna, I will give the floor to you, then a short time for Misha and Nicola to comment on the first 3 comments, and then we go to Carolina, Bechev, and Florence. Please, Susanna.
Thank you, and I want to do 2 small remarks. The first is, I think that one of the problems the European Union has is that it's always only, and it is till now, we are speaking about political things, about politics, but in reality, the European Union is an economic union, and it has to start to be a political union. Before this will be, we won't have the possibility to help states like Ukraine, like the Western Balkan. And the second remark is, we are speaking about Ukraine, we are speaking about the Western Balkan, and there are not only NATO like an elephant in the room, but there is Russia and there is Serbia like elephants in the room, and we are speaking around them as if they don't exist, but they exist. And from Russia we know that not only she exists in Ukraine, but she exists in the Balkans, she exists in Syria and in Africa. And I know we have a panel about how to change Russia, but anyway, I think we should speak about what Russia is doing in all these places in every panel, because this is the point of everything, and it affects, of course, the European Union. Sorry, I didn't. It was a typical slip. It affects.
It's not Bush. It's fine. It's not that kind of slip.
It affects the European Union, and the European Union should discuss this. And we should discuss the point of are we a political union or are we only an economic union? I remember that with all things going on in Hungary, we never the European Union never intervened till there wasn't a problem with the money. And then the European Union is there, but only when it's a problem of the money. Thank you.
Nicola, Misha, you have some comments on this? Who wants to start? Yeah.
Yes.
No, just, it's off. You can sit. Just a mic, please. You have this on your head.
I can use
Sorry. Yeah.
both mics, I guess. So, what Ivan said, this new trend of using blackmail as a way of showing sovereignty, and what Natalie said, the 2 processes must go together, I think this is probably the solution. We have a union of 27 that really struggles to make decisions, including on banning Russian oil, talking about Ukraine. So to make it functional, and if we are serious about 6 new small countries joining, and possibly 3 countries of the Eastern Partnership, it makes sense to seriously consider moving from anonymity to qualified majority voting. This will help the ambition to become a global player. This will also help enlargement.
Right.
Because enlargement can be torpedoed by one single member state on whatever issue, not quite related to the Copenhagen criteria. So I think, and this is the way to tie in the 2 processes together. One point I didn't make. When we want peace in the Balkans, with major engagement by our American friends, the long-term vision to keep it stable was the European vision. We can all be part of the EU, we will reform, and at some point borders will become obsolete. It won't really matter. When we see the fading away of the European vision in the last years because of the kaput enlargement, it's again on the surface, the border debate is back, whether it was the non-paper that was denounced later on by Ljubljana, or the idea of the land swaps, or so this region is not still beyond the line of certainty. And if we continue to muddle through and don't take this seriously, it's not too difficult to, maybe it's not imminent, but problems will come back. And there are countries in the region who are seriously arming themselves. I probably not worth going in details in that debate.
Can I just come back on 2 points there. Ivan, your point about post-heroism. If you take the new heroism, you're in the European Union, a la Orban or whatever, to its logical conclusion, well, we've already seen that with the United Kingdom. And of course, Johnson models himself on Churchill, but he's gone the whole hog and left the European Union, and what that has exposed is that if you do try to restore an earlier model, in this case Churchill, then history repeats itself as farce, because that's what we have in the United Kingdom now, is farce. Because we took that heroism to its very limits and actually left the Union. I hope, Susanna, that I wasn't on Serbia avoiding the issue. I think I started to address the issue. I think it's important to understand in the Western Balkans, there is a very strong narrative now reflected in a piece in the Spiegel 2 weeks ago that Serbia is relentlessly on a path of confrontation. I thought this was a very unfair interpretation. Serbia faces real dilemmas. Vučić was in Milosevic's entourage, so he knows very, very well that Milosevic's key mistake was to support the coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, earning him the undying hatred of Boris Yeltsin, which made life really difficult for Milosevic. Serbia's relationship with Russia is not quite as simple as it is often portrayed. Serbia's militarization in the late 19th century, early 20th century was carried out by Prussia, not by Russia. And so these are shifting alliances. Things can change, perceptions can change, and I think it's important that we realize that there is by no means unity between the Serbian leadership in Belgrade, for example, and the Serbian leadership in Banja Luka.
Carolina?
Yes, thank you so much. It was fascinating. I would like to start with an echo of Susanna's remark about the elephant in the room being Russia. We should probably not forget that if we discuss rebuilding Ukraine, if we discuss learning from the Western Balkans, it's not only about when, it's also about with whom, and it's also a question about Russia. And I'm talking about it with respect to the notion that was mentioned during your discussion, Nicola and Misha, namely reconciliation. So, in dealing with the evil in the past, there are basically two models. First model is reconciliation. Reconciliation is an institution which is basically based on equality. So there is no actor who is guilty and no actor who has been hurt. Basically, both sides have something to say to each other. So it's at least potentially democratic. The ideal model would be the South African reconciliation, controversial as it is. Also, reconciliation is very often connected with the past, with the evil that is already in the past. Like Hannah Arendt, when she describes what reconciliation is, she says it's looking from a bridge to the burden of the past. It's not something that is going on now. But we have also another model, which is a model of forgiveness in politics. Forgiveness was already mentioned by one of our audience members today. So forgiveness is something completely different. Forgiveness is not equal. There is a guilt which is defined. One actor is guilty, the other one is asked to be generous enough to forgive. And very often with the forgiveness understood as such, there is also connected the fact that this guilty actor is after an ultimate defeat. The ideal type, of course, is Germany here. So I would like to ask you, when you reflect on reconciliation and forgiveness, and what is going on now in Ukraine, would you choose any model? Would you tell us to learn from the Balkans or not learn from the Balkans, to learn from Germany or not learn from Germany? What would you do?
We'll pick Dimitr's and Heather's questions, then answer that and go to Florence, Gerhard, and there. Okay. Please.
Well, since the session is called Lessons from the Western Balkans, let's remember that early on there was a clear lesson from Yugoslavia that post-Soviet elites absorbed. I mean, this month we lost Leonid Kravchuk and also Shushkevich in Belarus, and when they signed the Belarus Agreement, Yugoslavia was the counterexample. So they wanted to avoid a scenario reminiscent of Milosevic's policies of reconquest and challenging borders. Of course, the Soviet collapse was messier elsewhere, but in those three core republics, Yugoslavia loomed large. It's a tragedy that now we have the Yugoslav scenario repeated by Putin on a very different scale and with all the qualifiers and the caveats. But early on, Yugoslavia was clearly an important precedent that basically helped those post-Soviet rulers. And for Yeltsin, it was important. So it's good that Misha brought up what Yeltsin learned or disliked about Milosevic. But my question really is about the current moment. And I was just wondering if we can reverse the questioning. In other words, what the Balkans can learn from Ukraine. I mean, remember one of the themes in the previous session that several people highlighted was this bottom-up energy of democratic participation, of civic spiritedness. It was the Ukrainians who launched the Euromaidan, who held Yanukovych to account and who are now protecting their homeland. And in the Balkans, the problem with Europeanization, it's been hijacked by elites. Whatever we think about Vucic, whether he's a bad guy or a tragic figure, I mean, he owns the process for better or worse, and the same applies to the rest of the political elite, and it leads to a lot of cynicism. But at the same time, we have moments of civic participations in the Balkans, the colorful revolution in then the Republic of Macedonia, where Nikola Dimitrov stood on the stage and challenged the then Prime Minister. In Serbia, in the run-up to the election, we had a mass mobilization around environmentalism. There are new parties emerging, but at the same time, there's cynicism, there's mobilization, there's fragmentation. So yeah, just to be the devil's advocate, can actually the Balkans learn something from Ukraine, take the positive example and build on what they already have to actually inject some meaning into this idea of Europe as a democratic model, because otherwise we are stuck with, I mean, let's be frank, that Europe is seen as supporter of the status quo, which is not really encouraging or inspiring anyone.
Thank you. Heather, please.
Thank you. To follow up on Karolina's really very interesting and important points about forgiveness and reconciliation, who will go down on his knees and beg the forgiveness of the Ukrainian people? And I ask this question of who because historically we've seen this tends to happen after a massive regime change and several further changes of government. It was Willy Brandt who went down on his knees in Warsaw to beg the forgiveness of the Polish people. It was Boris Tadic who did it at Srebrenica.
And in Ovčara.
Yes, yeah. And yes, exactly. And so it takes time and it takes massive political change. When might this happen in Russia? And who might be the president of Russia who would have the courage to do that as an individual and know that he had the backing of the Russian people? At the moment, this is unimaginable, that there could be a Russian leader who could gain power in the country in order to take this step. So it's clearly incredibly important that justice is done, that war crimes are documented, and I really salute those, including people here, who are documenting those crimes so that they're on record, so that people know what really happened historically, and that the disinformation cannot win out. But it's very hard to see how reconciliation could happen through an acknowledgement of guilt by the leadership of Russia. But this remains a really important question because Putin is there is something true in what he said about not the identification of Russian and Ukrainian people, but of the conjoined destiny of the two countries. It matters hugely to Ukraine what happens in Russia. It also matters enormously to Russia what happens in Ukraine. And the way I would just link this to the Balkans is to point out that one of Putin's biggest motivations, I suspect, in actually going to war was that Zelensky was making Ukraine too much of a good example and showing Russians what can be done by running things in a different way from the way that they're run in Russia. And we've seen that in the Balkans, Russian influence has been very deep in countries where there might be a risk of a liberal, democratic, economically integrated with Europe kind of model might succeed. And we see, unfortunately, the way that he's put in money, but also all kinds of other influence. Hybrid warfare continues from Russia in the Balkans through the disinformation, through money to political parties and individuals, and so on. And I'm really reluctant to say this, but it's incredibly important to acknowledge this is also the case in the European Union, and it affects enlargement. One of the reasons why enlargement has been going so slowly and North Macedonia has been blocked for so long is because of Russian influence in the European Union through one political leader who is prepared to act as Putin's agent. And this is an unfortunate truth that it's very hard for the rest of the EU to acknowledge because once you're a member state, you can't actually be kicked out. You can only leave voluntarily. So Russia's hybrid warfare or Putin, let me put it this way, Putin's hybrid warfare on the success of liberal democratic models is unfortunately affecting the Balkans through the medium of EU enlargement, which is why it's really critical to go back to the whole question of what really are the criteria for becoming an EU member and applying them consistently.
And I would like to add to what you said, and at the end, who will put Putin or military leadership of Russia to trial and where? And when? And one of those whens. Florence, Caroline, can I just ask you to put the name down? Caroline, thank you.
So one of the things I find interesting when we talk about enlargement is that in many circles in the EU, it is seen as a problem for all the reasons that we heard earlier. But on the other hand, we also heard earlier that European has become, for EU member states, synonymous with EU. So ultimately, what we're looking at the moment is potentially the final stage of the European peace project, Because if all Balkan states, if all Eastern European states that currently signal they want to join, then the project is more or less complete, with the exception of Norway, Switzerland, and there's also the case of Turkey. But ultimately, it would mean the ultimate success of the European project. Now, I find it interesting because I think we get bogged down in the technicality, and we're looking at all these painful considerations, treaty change, etc., etc. But nothing could be historically more important after the painful moment of Brexit to have citizens in Maidan protest with a European Union flag, which before was considered perhaps something boring. I'm old enough to remember that in the 90s, when I was a teenager, the EU was a boring bureaucratic project. Now people are willing to die for it. So I think that's perhaps something important to remember, that it's not first of all a problem, it's first of all historic success. If we seize the opportunity, if we don't miss the window. But I think it doesn't, as I said earlier, or actually the question, what lessons can we draw? The Balkans isn't just about the EU delaying things, even though I agree with several of your points. It is also about frozen conflict. When we're looking at Bosnia-Herzegovina, we're looking at Serbia and Kosovo, there are things that need to be fixed. And goes back to my point earlier, where I warned of a poor peace between Ukraine and Russia, which would actually hurt Ukraine in the long term, because it would hurt its ambitions to become an EU member state. So what lessons, and it goes back to actually what Dimitrov, what you said earlier, it's perhaps not what lessons can we draw from the Balkans, what can the Balkans learn from Ukraine? It's these things that are actually, I think, much more in the way of moving ahead than corruption, democratic backsliding, etc. These things need to be fixed. But if they are fixed, I think we're looking at an end of history, at least on the European Union, on the European continent, not in the world, but on the European continent.
Wow. Gerard? And then...
Yes, well, I very much agree with this historic vision that what we are in. But then it is all the more troubling to have, Nikola Dimitrov, who's been a minister, making very painful compromises in a difficult issue to get to the European Union, say, and he's completely right, that the current process in the Balkans is kaput. It doesn't work. It no longer inspires people. And when I asked German politicians in recent weeks, who've been saying for many, many months now, we will revive our engagement, we will travel to the Balkans, the foreign minister traveled to the Balkans, Olaf Scholz will go to the Balkans, what this all means concretely. For example, are you ready? Well, one hopes.
My God. No,
I'm
really, I cannot bear that anymore, sorry.
Well, the trouble is, when one asks them completely, does that mean that you would be prepared to say that it would be in Germany's interest that tiny Montenegro might join the Union in the next 4 years to take a place that is already there from the United Kingdom and creates no institutional problems at all? The answer is silence. There is a huge gap between the rhetoric and there is a lesson for Ukrainians. Dear Ukrainians, when you hear you're part of the European family, you have a European perspective, you belong to us, you will get conditional candidate status. This is what Kosovo got, which has already, which can't even apply to join. So if, and I know these are the discussions buzzing around in Berlin, can't we sell conditional candidate status to Ukraine as a success? No, it's not a success. Because what is behind those words, and it is a symbol. It is a symbol, but it is a symbol that could mean a lot. And if in June the lesson is that not even that symbol is going to be given in an unqualified manner, it is a message to Vladimir Putin. Yes. The European Union is too divided even now to give Ukraine the symbol that it gave to Turkey in 1999, which is 23 years ago. And the problem then is, if you get that symbol, and that's the other lesson from the Balkans, not to fall into the Balkan trap, which is a non-functional, kaput accession process, which is not meant to lead anywhere. And I think some of the ideas, what Heather was talking about, I'll talk about it later, but some of the ideas about what can be achieved that you can discuss immediately and how you lock it in and I think use that moment of maximum sympathy across Europe to lock things in. And in the European Union, that often taking the form of a binding agreement. It will not be an agreement to join, but it could be an agreement to get the 4 freedoms. And last point on this, Nicola mentioned it. Playing off the Balkans against Ukraine. I've seen this the last few weeks. It is so transparent, but not all Ukrainians who haven't followed the Balkans, I understand that much, have immediately realized this. When you hear from some politicians in some big countries, we really love Ukraine, but unfortunately, you shouldn't leapfrog the process because we've got these other countries who've been waiting in line. There's one way to get around this. That is to talk to those countries in the Balkans. You know what is happening yesterday in Serbia? Charles Michel was there. The Serbian president said, I would like the 4 freedoms. I have candidate status. I have an accession process. They're not going anywhere. What I would like is that the promise that the European Union made in 1957 of removing barriers is applied to Serbia. And then we work on this the next 4 years. This is not technical. This is fundamentally political. That is the promise. A political vision, and Natalie put it well, a political project in technical clothing is what the EU has been from the beginning. And it was not the idea of technocrats or bureaucrats. It was leaders like Jean Monnet and Schuman and Paul-Henri Spaak and others who had experienced war, destruction, disaster, occupation, and who then said the way out of this is actually taking these technical things with a political vision. The Balkans are being told, oh, these technical things, well, we give you promises, but let's not get too focused on this. And now President Macron says, why don't we have this big conversation? All these democracies coming together, talking in general, political stuff. We have the Council of Europe. While we talk at this moment, foreign ministers of 46 member states of the Council of Europe are right now sitting in Turin at their ministerial summit. There are 46 members, all of us are members, except for Kosovo. That exists. We don't need a new institution for that. What we need is the vision of Schuman, Monnet, Spaak, removing barriers, real integration. And that's what the Balkans need, and that's what Ukraine needs, and that's the lesson.
I knew it, Olivia.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put the phone away. Technical projects under political guises. I think it's one of the key topics today. And when I hear the conversation about learning lessons from the Balkans, in the back of my mind, I hear, what can we learn from histories of inconsistencies? And how does the EU reposition itself as a political project? And it strikes me that since this morning, we've been talking about Ukraine in the context already of what do we do right after the war ends? But we don't exactly ask the question, what is the significance of Ukraine as a whole? And how does it fit into a larger Russian strategy, which is what you were also pointing to, Suzanne. And I think for me, as part of the research that I've been doing, we're missing one element, which is talking about the future, not just about the past. And in order to talk about the future, we need to talk about the type of strategies that the EU and Russia are looking at or drawing for themselves. And for this, I need to join a picture which is much larger and which is around climate change and technological change. We're facing a situation in the EU where we have a political project, which is the Green Deal, which is predicated essentially on decarbonizing. And in order to decarbonize, we need to rely on new supply chains and on a new type of economic metabolism, which involves relying on different types of resources, such as critical materials, which, amongst other things, we find in Ukraine. In Russia, if you look at their national defense strategy, you find a rationale and a narrative about how imperative it is to diversify their economy in the face of a very unstable geopolitical and geoeconomic context, so as to make sure that they face increasing levels of sanctions and that they face increasing levels of climate disruptions, including in agricultural terms as well as in industrial terms.
Where does Ukraine fit in all of that? As it so happens, in July 2021, Ukraine struck a strategic partnership with the European Union to diversify supply chains for critical raw materials which are needed for decarbonization, digitalization, and new types of defense systems. And Szelényi was mentioning this morning that the moment when Ukraine draws one step closer towards the European Union, Russia intervenes. July 2021, 8 months down the line, we have an invasion. This is not to bring down the reasons and the motivations only to resources and those critical raw materials, but we have to factor this in because at the end of the day, what I've been seeing in my own research is that Russia has understood the risks and opportunities of an unstable world, which is transitioning into a different type of energy system, which is going to affect its clientelist system and its economic base, and for which it needs to diversify. So what we're seeing is essentially an attempt to destabilize European projects around decarbonization, and therefore a new type of geopolitical construction. And we're not just seeing it in Ukraine. Russia, through different actors such as Wagner, sits on troves of deposits for rare earths, lithium, cobalt, borate, and other types of materials needed for the future of the economic system behind the Green Deal. And it's doing so in contexts such as the Central African Republic, Mali, Cameroon, Gabon, Mozambique, you name them. And then also in Latin and Central America, there is a much, much larger vision at play.
And we have to leave it at for the Russia maybe session.
We can.
Yeah,
I just want to sort of, draw this sort of explanation to what does it mean indeed in terms of Ivan's point and Natalie's point about what does it mean for the EU? I think that part of the question that we need to be asking is not just, how can we rebuild Ukraine, but indeed, how can we rebuild the EU in a context of geopolitical changing, shifts of tectonic plates, and how essentially there is a need for the EU to consider anything regarding the future of Ukraine and the Western Balkan in a way which is indeed economic, which is indeed political. And we have started doing that, and I'm quite relieved to say that, this week we have the international sort of energy strategy that was published as part of the Repower EU communication, where we do look for the very first time at how to integrate energy systems that include Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, the Western Balkans, that look at a geopolitical situation and how the EU can reconstruct itself. But it needs to go much beyond that. But we have essentially some building blocks to, sort of think of the future of the EU in a very different light, which is geopolitical and political at the same time.
Thank you so much. I'm looking just at the time. We have 3 more discussants, and then we will open a little bit for the audience. When we finished, I will give the floor first to Olga, then to Susanna, and I leave Maria for the end.
Thank you.
Just keep it short. We'll have 6 minutes for 3 interventions,
Yes,
so 2 minutes each.
I will try to be short. As a Ukrainian listening to these debates and also to the statements of the European Union officials, sometimes I feel like what is frustrating is very often the lack of ambition and the lack of confidence on behalf of the very European leaders in their own strengths and in their ability to both take Russia accountable and also support Ukraine and to give a new meaning to the whole project of the European Union and European integration. Things that were unimaginable before February 24th have become reality. And I think the response should be, in a sense, symmetrical. The things that were not imaginable or that looked very difficult to, draft and implement and to envisage, they should be taken into consideration, they should be discussed, and there shouldn't be a lot of focus on all the challenges and the constraints and why this or that cannot be done, or we cannot imagine the day when Putin will be taken into account. But we should be working together on thinking how should we approach this day and how can we change also our policy. In terms of I think it should be a common goal of Ukraine and the free democratic world that supports it to not just support Ukraine victory and make it possible, but also make possible a defeat of Putin's regime. And there are still so many leverages that haven't been used by the West that the West tends to underestimate. Starting from the oil and gas embargo, of course, there will be a lot of objections why or this cannot be done, why is this difficult. But are these objections really equal with the threat of prolonging the war and losing more lives, not just in Ukraine, eventually seeing this war expanded to other countries? So I think the action should be taken now, and we should be more ambitious and not just actually in the rhetoric and just really rhetorically supporting Ukraine, but taking the Ukraine's example as a call to action and a call to draft policies, ambitious policies, and rethink the whole structure of the European institutions that are in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna.
Thank you. Even if we go for the very positive and perspective that Gerard and many other of you propose to Ukraine and the Balkans to anchor these countries now and here as much as possible, we will still have very serious obstacles. And I think Misha mentioned the symbiotic relationship between money and politics and the neoliberal world. And I would like to open this a little bit and hear of your opinion a bit more, because both in the Balkans and in Ukraine there are oligarchs intertwined with politics, and if you get money from the European Union, you can build such a structure even in countries where this did not exist before, like in Hungary. So, and the EU was not even able to not just hinder this process, but not even track it. So where there is big money, there are big ways to steal them. So what do you see any agency basically to stand up against this phenomena, which is so global?
Now I will give floor to Misha and Nicola to wrap it up, and Maria will conclude. Please, Misha will pick up on Susanna, and what we heard, we can make a round of short comments on everything.
Okay, I'll go as quickly as possible. On the EU flag being a symbol of excitement in Maidan and so on, I'm afraid in the Western Balkans it acts as bromide. It is deeply unsexy in the Western Balkans, and that's because of the peculiar circumstances which differentiate Ukraine from the Western Balkans. But it addresses this issue of how do you make the EU not just more exciting, but how do you make it politically dynamic? We know that Poland and Hungary, for example, since Ukraine, the famous Polish-Hungarian friendship, which goes back hundreds of years, has broken apart very, very quickly. What is the European Union doing in the face of that reality, i.e. a clear vulnerability on the part of autocracy in both Poland and Hungary? Well, it's sort of trying to pressurize Hungary a bit more. Is it giving Poland a free ride? I don't know, but surely this is a political moment, an opportunity which a more dynamic political structure would be able to exploit in order to reduce the influence of both Orban and Kaczynski. I want to, I'll come to the oligarch thing at the end. I want to address on the reconciliation thing. I'm sorry that I keep raising the issue of the United Kingdom, but the most successful peace project of the last 30 years or so was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Now, the reason why it's really important, I know it's not comparable with Ukraine because it's a much smaller country, but it was a very intense conflict both in Northern Ireland and on mainland Britain as well. How was that conflict fixed? That conflict had three or four elements. One, all the external actors bought into it. The United States, the Irish government, the United Kingdom, and crucially Brussels as well. A lot of money was poured into Northern Ireland. It's still to this day subsidised by about 11 billion pounds a year. And specifically inside Northern Ireland, there was an agreement that both sides would forgive and prosecutions would not take place. This was hard for ordinary people on both sides to accept, but it actually worked. One thing that didn't happen was reconciliation. People still went to segregated schools, sectarian schools, Catholic or Protestant. And that means when you pull one little brick out of the house of peace that was built, you threaten the entire structure, which is why Brexit is so damaging for Northern Ireland and why the prospect of peace is by no means certain again. The reason why I bring that is in terms of any peace arrangement afterwards has to bear in mind all of those various factors. Because one thing I think we can be fairly confident on about this is there is not going to be a clear-cut end to this war. So we have to think about what are the structures you need to deal with it. With regards to the oligarchs and criminal oligarchic systems, they very quickly develop deep roots into societies, into economies, and into structures. And they're very tough roots, and they're really difficult to pull out. And I'm afraid this is something where you need time, but where you do have institutional and democratic mechanisms inside the European Union which over time will, if not totally pull out those roots, at least they will reduce their toxicity. And we have seen some real moves forward in that in countries like the Baltic states. It's by no means a perfect path, but ultimately it's still something that the European Union can offer, provided, of course, that it looks to its own home as well, because there is deep corruption in parts of Germany, in parts of France, certainly in the United Kingdom, although that doesn't matter anymore.
Thank you so much, Misha. Nicola, sure, your comments.
Yes.
Another thing, I said, you can't yet give Britain's place to Montenegro because we need that for Scotland.
Reserved. It's a rich debate, so I don't think I will even attempt to do justice to touch upon everything that was raised. It touched me this, I think, very correct emphasis on asking for forgiveness precedes forgiveness. And I think we are very long. This is in a very distant future because now it's unthinkable that this will happen. Accountability, we don't have much time to discuss it. I think there is progress in the international thinking on the planet on accountability for war crimes, for the worst crimes against humanity. This usually happens, though, to defeated powers, Nuremberg, Tokyo, or to small powers, Liberia, Ivory Coast. So what's going in the direction of accountability is the brutality of the terror that we witness, almost live streaming of this also. I think the leadership in Kiev made a very good decision to allow for foreign correspondents to be inside, we get reliable testimonials. Who knows what happens? Many countries are becoming serious about this, but there are many hurdles in the way to accountability, especially when it comes to higher levels of leadership, up to Putin. Okay. As a professional candidate country that has perfected patience, we are the veterans of the candidate status in the Balkans. What Gerald said really resonates with me. And you have to make a mockery out of this phrase, European perspective. If you hear it for so long, over so many years,
you lose the meaning.
From the perspective of a veteran candidate country, it becomes, when they say you're part of the European family, they means we are not really ready to make a serious decision. There is no political will behind it. So I think, yes, okay, no time.
Please, thank you.
And last line on.
He took your question. Target.
On political will and vision. I think Europe will have to decide where its borders are and whether it's going to go, even in the long run, gradually towards one Europe, or it will settle for several Europes, where few countries will have the whole package, others will have to live in illiberal societies, and a third circle where they will have to settle for the Council of Europe-like ideas. And I think the right vision, if ambitious, is go for one Europe.
One Europe, Maria.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make a step back and return to a question of forgiveness. And because numerous Balkans wars have shown us that the question of national, ethnic and religious identity cannot be neglected by the world, by the Western world. It's important. So it is hard to talk about forgiveness while the national identity and the right for being sovereign country is being violated by another sovereign country. And it's exactly the same what is happening now between Russia and Ukraine. The right for independency and the identity of one country is denied by another country. So if we just neglect this question, if we just take all these countries together and ask them to forgive each other and live in peace without studying deeply this problem, the wars will be continuous, the problem will be repeatedly. So it's also important questions, and we have also lessons that we have to learn from Balkans and Ukrainians.
That's the question of accountability. 9 minutes. If you ask questions, we can have 6, but please, the audience, raise hands. Second row, please give me light. Second row, white shirt, I can see that much. The lady. Oh my God, this is like a disco, not a... Thank you.
Hello, my name...
Just the questions, please.
Yeah, just a question. Hello, my name is Amanda Coakley. I'm a Europe's Futures Fellow at the IWM and a journalist. We haven't spoken about China, and there's been a lot of talk in recent years about Chinese involvement in the Western Balkans, that's blocking enlargement, so I'd appreciate someone's thoughts on that. And then I'd also appreciate someone's thoughts on why is China so quiet right now around the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Thank you.
Quiet China in the Western Balkans. Hands? Someone wants to answer China? Okay, second question, then we'll find someone for China. Second question, sir.
Thank you very much for the interesting debate. I'm a former German diplomat with many years of experience in the Balkans and in Russia. I want to come to something, back to something Mr. Glenny said in the very beginning. He used the word cigarette smuggling. 3 days ago, the president of Montenegro was received for the third time in less than 4 years by the German president. And it was not only me as a former German ambassador to Montenegro, but also many other of my friends in the Balkans and in Germany who were actually quite appalled by it, if we know for what Mr. Đukanović stands. And Mr. Glenny just said something about the oligarchic structure, about corruption, not only in the Balkans, but also in EU countries like my country. Indeed, I see there a major problem Also for Ukraine in the future.
And decision-making as such.
Yes,
yeah.
in the future, how can we overcome this very deep-rooted corruption
so much.
and organized crime? Because I think the people in the Balkans and also in Ukraine are not only running away because life is miserable, but because they are fed up with a system which doesn't give them any right and
More
rule of law.
hands. We're going to take another question. Is there any questions? Here we go.
Thank you very much. I'm also a former diplomat. And ask an undiplomatic question to those, particularly Prime Minister Dimitrov. Isn't the lesson we can draw from the Balkans for Ukraine that the European Union has to get do away with one terrible concept, which is neo-colonialist, arrogant, and bureaucratic, which is the concept of conditionality. And I think all the Balkan states who try to be members suffer from this conditionality concept, which puts the so-called European values and the ones who are in above all the others who are out. And this is something which one should probably, the Ukraine crisis may change by rattling the entire system.
Even though Macron said we need these conditions for decades to come for Ukraine to become a member. Thank you so much. Nicola will pick up on conditionality, Misha on corruption, we'll find someone on China. We have 5 minutes. Nicola, China.
Someone, one of the better thinkers in Europe recently said that there is a dilemma whether enlargement is about creating progress towards a vibrant democracy governed by the rule of law, or it's a process that jumps in once this progress has been done domestically, and then it locks it in. And I think today we have enough, we've seen enough to see that without serious efforts both in the countries in the process and without the political will around the EU table, it fails on both counts. It does not transform, and it does not prevent backsliding even after you join the EU, and we have discussed Hungary to some extent, well, also Poland, we can mention other countries here as well. So I think this dichotomy is to some extent fake, but if we go and discuss enlargement without conditionality, then let's say North Macedonia joins the EU today.
A great point. Misha, please, we don't have a super point. Misha.
Keep it relentlessly, that was mine.
Okay, I'll be as quick as possible. Organized crime is not just about bad people and corrupt structures. It's about supply and demand of commodities which are illicit. Actually, what we've seen in the last 10 years is a remarkable movement around the world towards the legalization of marijuana, which accounts for something in the region of 70% of profits made of the illegal drugs trade here in the European Union and the United Kingdom. It's now been fully legalized in Canada. It's happening all over the United States, happening in Central and South America, happening in parts of Europe, and Germany will be a big sign if that happens. So the reason I raise this is organized crime is not just about chasing the bad guys. It's about policy. And the policy that we're seeing at the moment, the slow shift of position on illicit narcotics will have a very significant impact on the ability of organized crime to operate. This is just incidentally happening because the production of narcotics is moving from the developing world into the developed world. So, for example, Holland is now the biggest producer of illegal pills, methamphetamines, and so on and so forth. and European police forces can no longer deal with the challenges posed by production, distribution, and consumption. Up until now, it was everyone in the developing world who were getting killed in their hundreds of thousands because of our drug habits. And now we're seeing a shift in policy because of the fact that production is coming here into Europe, and it's probably a very good thing.
And we find China guy, Ivan. Or Natalie, sorry, Natalie will take it. You have 30 seconds for such a small question. You will take, yeah, we
I
have,
can start with the 15 seconds.
30
China
seconds.
likes the Balkans in the way they are. No, this is not a cynical statement. Being close to the European Union, not being keen, useful infrastructure, corruption-friendly environment. So from this point of view, it's not a transformative power.
Thank you all really for your great inputs. Give a round of applause. And I'll give floor to Boris.
So, I think, Ivana, you did a great job. Thank you very much. Well, you started with a Greek tragedy, and I think we ended with a Greek tragedy a bit. So we didn't leave the format. Yeah, Greek. So I want to announce now that we have a break until 2:30 sharp. Be here at 2:30. We will start the afternoon with 2 sessions. Is it the Central European moment in Europe right now? And how will the European Union be transformed? So we will step into those topics anyway a bit more in the afternoon. Enjoy the break. Enjoy the day. Thank you.